2 weeks ago, I ended my sermon by suggesting that if people in this community did not raise the level of public discourse, then I wasn't sure who exactly was going to take on that task. Today we have a Bible story where it seems like two groups of people, or a person and a group of people, are talking past each other, very emblematic of the ways in which we might talk past one another in 2016. The Sadducees are in a state of great tension with Jesus in the 20th chapter of Luke's Gospel. I believe Betsy used the term muckety-mucks to describe the Sadducees. That is not a term that has ever come out of my mouth before, so I'm most pleased to be opened up to that term. The Sadducees were an enormously important group of people in the Jerusalem of antiquity. They were responsible for maintaining the temple, privileged, often considered quite learned. And the Sadducees would have been in tension with Jesus and some of his contemporaries because Jesus seems to have this belief in resurrection. So they offer this, as you've now seen, this rather absurd hypothetical where a woman is married over and over and over again. They ask him, to whom will she be married in the afterlife? This is kind of a gotcha Facebook post from 2,000 years ago where somebody or some group will decide upon the outcome and then work backwards in constructing a weird analogy or strangely cherry-picking evidence and data in order to prove a particular point. I saw a little thing yesterday that simply said, "I've completely changed my political views due to your multiple Facebook posts," said no one ever. And then I saw a counterpoint to that which said, yes, there is a counterpoint to that which said, "When friends give you a hard time for posting about politics, remind them that if Thomas Jefferson or Martin Luther King were alive today, they would not be posting photos of kittens." This strikes me as a little bit of projection on our part. So we have this absurd scenario from the Sadducees about resurrection because they did not believe in the resurrection. Indeed, this is an important theological point for them. What's also critical for their theology is that the written books of Moses, the first 5 books in what we call the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, those 5 books are authoritative. And that those books should be read, not necessarily literally, but without unnecessary explanation or embellishment, addition, or interpretation. What you read is what is there. And so, in order to answer this in-your-face post about something of critical importance, Jesus is confronted with several choices, of course. He could walk away. We all do know, don't we, in this modern age, that we are allowed to walk away from preposterous arguments. You are allowed to do that. He could shout back. He could answer in a way that jives with his own moral or theological framework. Or he could make an attempt, at least, at answering the Sadducees within the moral and theological framework of the Sadducees themselves. What I mean is he says that the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush. Clearly, he is referencing the book of Exodus there, one of the books that the Sadducees themselves regard as authoritative. And then he says, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Meaning that in that particular story where God appears to Moses in the story of the burning bush, and God says that God's own name is I am what I am, or I am who I am. And also that God is the God of Abraham, a person who died many years ago. Jesus is employing scripture that is authoritative for the Sadducees in a way that the Sadducees don't just understand, but they would themselves employ. He says, it's right there in your text. You can't quibble too much with that, surely. And of course, they probably did quibble with what Jesus had to say. Perhaps things were far too heated in that moment for any minds to be changed. And Jesus participated perhaps in that all too human experience of feeling like the perfect answer was offered that ought to settle the debate, and it settled precisely nothing which we know all too well. Someone says, there is Sharia law in Dearborn, Michigan right now. Hey, I called the town hall in Dearborn, and they said there's no Sharia law there. You're a liar! What do you do with that? A man named Rob Willer is a sociologist at Stanford, and he writes these days about morality. He says we all have a moral framework. Of course we do. Way of understanding the world, way of understanding good and evil, and we all have certain levers within our moral framework that we pull in order to determine right from wrong, moral and immoral. Willer and plenty of others have suggested that people on the political spectrum, liberals and conservatives, are motivated by different moral levers. That there is a spectrum of moral frameworks, but people who are progressive tend to be motivated by different things than conservatives. People who identify as progressives tend to be motivated primarily by issues of harm, especially harm to another person, but it could also be harm to an animal. Progressives are also motivated, of course, by issues around fairness. Conservatives, on the other hand, are much more interested in sanctity, purity, loyalty, authority, and patriotism. Now, intuitively, at least for me, this makes sense. What doesn't make sense is that if intuitively this makes sense, why do I feel like I am walking through my life banging my head against the wall? Why is it that if there is a consistent moral empathy gap, a failure to appreciate another's moral framework, why we can't seem to get past that? Why, we wonder, does it seem that when I am using facts, data, truth, and evidence, that the only people who agree with me are the people who already agreed with me, who already seem to be getting what I was trying to say? I once had a spirited debate with a conservative man named Cameron out in Colorado. Cameron is brilliant. We worked together on several issues in town, and I made an assumption that Cameron would see my particular point of view on an important issue. We started to get into it a little bit, and I became dismayed by something that Cameron said, and I blurted out, "Cameron, that is just not fair." And Cameron replied, "Dave, in my house, there are 2 4-letter words that start with F. You know one of them, and the other is F-A-I-R. My children are not allowed to say that word. Fair has got nothing to do with anything. Life is not fair. The way the food chain works is not fair. War is unfair. Nature is unfair. I have no time for fair." And I remember being so completely disoriented by this really smart guy who made the claim that fairness had absolutely nothing to do with morality. I was completely knocked off my tracks. There is no silver bullet, no magic trick to getting people who share different opinions from you to change. Politics, theology, morality, they may not be hardwired, but they are deeply entrenched, are they not? Nevertheless, people change. Society changes. We can take issues that are important to us and we can begin to engage people employing their moral framework in order to make good and positive change in our society. Many of us would regard marriage equality as having been a positive change in our society. In 1982, the Defense Department said that homosexuality was incompatible with military service, a patriotic notion. But by the 2000s, the idea that lesbian and gay soldiers were every bit as patriotic as straight Americans was part and parcel of the argument, for equality. The last 10 years, I would argue that when the question of rights for all really picked up steam, this became a matter not just of fairness, but also of loyalty. The more brave boys and girls, men and women told their families about their sexual orientation, the more the response of many moderate and conservative families became not about what's fair, but about how to be loyal to their children and to their family unit. While fairness and harm were critical for liberals, patriotism and loyalty were important for moderate and conservative Americans. This is why when you want to, as a progressive, talk to a conservative about climate change, you may be heavily motivated by fairness for children or grandchildren or animals, but you should never start a conversation with someone on the other side of the debate by talking about fairness or about owls or polar bears. Because a conservative will look at you and say, "What about jobs? Polar bears are Canadian, they're not even American. You want to save the polar bears rather than protect American jobs? What kind of patriot are you?" You have left their moral matrix, and instead you have held up a mirror and you have spoken to yourself, trying to convince yourself that you are really good at making a moral argument that you already know. You want to talk about climate change? Never talk about climate change. Talk about purity. The purity of our rivers, the sanctity of God's creation. Talk about how disgusting pollution is. Imagine a world where someone's favorite fishing hole is destroyed by chemicals, and on it goes. We can spend a lifetime screaming into the wind about fairness and equality if we are progressive, or loyalty and purity and patriotism if we are conservative, and yet we remain bewildered why half the country does not seem to get our point of view, when it is so obvious to us how right we are. This is important for lots of reasons. Yes, it's important because you want to engage your cranky uncle or your neighbor who drives you crazy and you're thinking about not talking to them anymore. But it is important too because there is a maxim that Jesus points us toward even as he tries to direct or redirect the Sadducees back to their own text and to their own moral framework. And it's easy to miss because we've got a lot of things on our minds right now. Last week, Betsy asked us to put our laments on the beach doors, those doors in the back of our sanctuary, between the sanctuary and the assembly room. On the other side of those doors, you may have noticed a whole bunch of Post-its. Some of you will have stuck those Post-its on the doors. Those doors symbolized last week the doors of Wittenberg, where Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517. Many of you offered powerful testimony to the dis-ease with the way things are. You placed notes that contained words like mass incarceration, bullying, genocide, hunger, stigmas around mental health, solitary confinement, tyranny of the minority, ignorance, poverty, zero-sum solutions, inadequate education, the Taliban, racial profiling, the new Jim Crow, our political process, work relationships, pipelines, a lack of sharing, a lack of freedom of speech in other nations, and on it went. Big issues with real problems that require thought and action and some good theology. Miroslav Volf once said that the first act of God was not resistance, but creation. The first word of God was affirmation, not negation. The first words of God, as affirmed by the people of God in Genesis, are, "Let there be light." From the off, we are told that God acts in creativity and affirmation. Jesus has this bam-in-your-face hypothetical from the Sadducees, and while he speaks their language, he also makes a statement about the character of the Creator. That God is a God of life. And God doesn't even know death, Jesus posits. This is why, in short order, Christians make the affirmation of faith, along with the disciples, that the stone was rolled back from the empty tomb. Jesus was resurrected, that the grave was overcome. God is a God not of darkness and death, but of life and light. No matter what happens on Tuesday, God, thank God, will still be God. And it will be up to us not to simply strategize about how to cover the moral empathy gap and speak to people who are different from us, but also to identify what it is that should be discussed. For to God, all are alive. Now, how do we proclaim that good news? We have fundamental choices about how our theology is expressed through the lenses of fairness and harm or purity and loyalty, but the affirmation for people of faith on this pilgrim journey remains. For to God all are alive, all have sanctity, all have value. These might inform our sense of what's right for refugees and what's right for Muslims and what's right for the ways that we value people who are working through mental health concerns and what's right for American Indians and what's right in thinking through the pay gap or the achievement gap or the new Jim Crow profiling and mass incarceration. It's not simply a matter of how we should talk, but it is significantly also a matter of theological convictions that are rooted in Jesus' affirmation that God is a God of life. God is not God of the dead, but of the living. God doesn't know death. God isn't dead. God can't have death be a part of God's own self, Jesus seems to say. God just cannot be that way. For to God, all are alive. It is, of course, an ultimate question for us. How might we now proclaim this basic and essential affirmation at a time like this? May God's peace be with you all.